Great. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this 2021 Festival of Social Science event entitled Shaping the Algorithms That Personalize Your Media. Thank you for joining us, everyone. And I think we'll just, we still have a few people joining. So I'll just take this moment, first of all, to introduce our panel and agenda to you very briefly before we start with the first talk. So I'm Philip Jackson. I'm a reader in machine listening at the Centre for Vision, Speech and Signal Processing here at the University of Surrey, and also co-investigator on the AI for Me project, investigating technologies to enable future personalised media experiences. So I have a particular personal interest in the talks this morning. I'm also absolutely delighted to be joined by our four speakers. We have, in fact, a pomposity of professors. That's the correct collective term, I understand. Plus, at the sharp end, an executive product manager from BBC R&D. So we have Professor Jack Stilgoe from the University College London. We have Professor Sabina Braun, Professor of Translation Studies here at Surrey. We have Professor John Colomos, also from CVSSP here at the University of Surrey, and Eleni Sharp, who's our Executive Product Manager from BBC. And I'll introduce each of them in a bit more detail when we come to their talks. But first of all, a warm welcome to all of them and all of you. Our proposed schedule for this morning is to have a series of talks, short talks from each of our four panelists. And after the first two talks, we may pause for some brief comments and questions. And again, at the end of the second pair of talks. And then after that, I'm hoping that we'll open out into a bit more of a broader discussion. And I'd welcome you to post your questions into the chat so that we can participate together and have a rich discussion. Okay, so our first speaker then is Professor Jack Stilgoe, Professor of Science and Technology Policy with the Department of Science and Technology Studies at UCL, and also a Fellow of the Alan Turing Institute. His research and teaching focuses on the governance of emerging technologies. He's currently Principal Investigator of the Driverless Futures project, funded by the Economic and Social Research Council. In 2013, he worked with the Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council to create a framework for responsible innovation. He has been an expert advisor to the European Commission, the Ada Lovelace Institute, the Wellcome Trust, and various parts of UK government. He's on the advisory board of the UKRI Trustworthy Autonomous Systems Hub, and he's been a fellow of the Turing Institute since 2018. His most recent books are Experiment Earth, Responsible Innovation in Geoengineering, Routledge 2015, and Who's Driving Innovation? New Technologies and the Collaborative State, Palgrave 2020. And so with that, I invite Jack to take the stage. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Philip. Hello, everybody. I'm just going to throw up my slides, as it were. Hopefully you can all see that. So yes, I'll aim for 10 minutes. So let me just try and offer some sort of framing comments that might be a little sort of off target in terms of the type of technology, because as Philip mentioned, most of my research at the moment is about self-driving cars, right? But I see self-driving cars as a really interesting test case for the real world deployment of algorithms, high stakes deployment of algorithms, right? If algorithms have mostly been about software, things I think get rather interesting and rather different when algorithms are in charge of 2 tons of metal at 70 miles an hour, right? And I think there's something very interesting about the social experiment of self-driving cars on public roads that tells us quite a lot about how we should think about technologies in context and how we might come up with good rules to govern those technologies. So one of the first insights from science and technology studies, my discipline, is that technologies are not just technical things, they are also political things, right? You can think about, rather unsophisticated automated technology. So that's a tomato harvester up at the top, which the philosopher Langdon Winner discussed in some detail. The tomato harvester that doesn't just change the way that we as a society pick tomatoes. It also changes the nature of labor. It changes the nature of our tomatoes, because you have to grow tomatoes that can survive the rigors of this machine. And technologies have sort of multiple rippling effects in the world. And we can ask political questions about them. Political questions like who decides, who gets what, who wins, who loses, that sort of thing. The example of a extremely simple technology down at the bottom right is from very near my university in Camden. This is a thing called the Camden bench, right? Which at first sight is just a lump of concrete. But it's a lump of concrete that designs, that has values built into it, right? It imagines a particular sort of user, and in particular, it imagines the proscribing of particular sorts of users, because this is an anti-homeless bench. It is also an anti-terrorist bench. So it is much more than just a lump of concrete. When we start asking political questions of things that look like just hard artifacts, we can start to see what these things mean, and we can start to make good decisions about them. So how does that work when we think about a prototypical technology like a self-driving car? So self-driving cars in one sense are already with us. If you live in Phoenix, Arizona, and the weather's nice and you want to go within a certain radius, you can get in one of these things through the company Waymo, who have this, this algorithmic promise that they offer to the world, which is that their computer can drive better than any human, that it can do so not just in the small block of Phoenix where it's currently being tested, but in the near future, it will be able to drive you anytime and anywhere. Now, they would say that, wouldn't they? Because they're interested in selling their technology, building enthusiasm for their technology, and spreading it to new places. But there's a risk, and whenever we talk about an algorithmic technology, there's a risk that we get sucked in by what I've called some myths of autonomy. And this applies to personalized media as well. It's a myth that algorithmic technologies give us highly personalized control and enable human beings to do new things and offer us new choices. In the case of the self-driving car, there are a number of promises that are made about the technology, all of which, when you start scratching at the promise, start to look a bit shaky. The one thing I just want to pick up on for this quick talk is this promise that the technology and its algorithms will be able to adapt to all of the world's complexity, right? That this is, I guess, one of the central promises of artificial intelligence, that it will be able to understand the world better than a human can and make quicker, more efficient, more rational decisions. What we see from the history of technology is that humans always need to adapt as well. And understanding the ways in which humans will need to adapt is part of understanding what these technologies might really mean. So the obvious place to look for a guide for the self-driving car is to the arrival of the motor car into cities in Western economies in the late part of the 19th century, early part of the 20th century. And here we saw, with the arrival of the motor car, very similar sorts of promises being made, right? It's easy to imagine that when new technologies arrive, they are full of, shiny, unperturbed benefits. The reality is not so neat. What did we know with the arrival of the motor car? Well, first, it did create more accidents, right? We are now in a situation where more than 1 million people die every year because of this technology, which is not to say it's, it hasn't also been an extraordinarily beneficial thing for the 20th century. But the technology imposed its promises on our lives in various ways, particularly if you live in places like Phoenix, Arizona, where those self-driving cars are currently being tested, which is a very car-friendly place. It's a very pedestrian-unfriendly place. So with the arrival of the motor car, we also had campaigns led by the automobile industry to get pedestrians off roads, in effect, to hand over shared spaces to benefit one technology. And that led to the creation of certain spaces that are now regarded as rather problematic, right? Car-dependent places. This is an aerial view of Phoenix, Arizona, where it is almost impossible to exist without this technology. Now, just to stay on the subject of Phoenix, Arizona for a little bit, it's also worth looking at what happens when technologies go wrong. This is a memorial to the woman Elaine Hertzberg, who has the rather dubious honor of being the first person to have been killed by a self-driving car, which happened in 2018. When technologies do go wrong, we learn more sociologically about technologies than when technologies go right. We learn about, the failures of algorithms to account for the world's complexity. In this case, to the failure to recognize and predict what sort of an object Elaine Hertzberg was. She was initially classified as a bicycle. There was some confusion. The algorithms thought that she was a pedestrian, failed to predict her actions, failed to react. Perhaps a bigger concern is not just the failure, but when failures happen, a failure to understand why they happen. And this is something that bedevils algorithms in all sorts of ways. So these are both shots from the sort of social experiment that is currently happening on American roads with Tesla's autopilot system, where on the left, what it's doing is thinking that a lorry full of traffic lights is traffic lights and wondering how it should react to those things. And on the right, it thinks that the moon is a yellow traffic light, and it doesn't know how to behave in the face of those things. And we don't know why it's making those mistakes, right? Because there is a sort of black box nature to those technologies. Because these systems, for them to work, right, always depend on humans and other connections with the world. So the narrative of autonomy is always more complicated. David Mindell, the historian of technology, says that only a rock is truly autonomous. The rest of the time, there are always humans. It's just sometimes hard to see where the humans are. And we know from sort of case studies of early robots in people's lives that people do have to adapt to them, right? The robot doesn't just take over the role of a human being. Robots don't just take over our jobs. The world has to adapt as well. There have been some lovely studies of the Roomba, right, which is probably the most ubiquitous everyday robot in domestic life, and the ways in which people need to rearrange their lives, their furniture, their pets, in order to make these technologies work. Now, when it comes to the self-driving car, we already have a set of rules that challenge the place of this technology in society. We have the rules of the road, right? We have a highway code, which is explicitly written for human common sense. There have been various campaigns to try to digitize this highway code, but that's not at all an uncontroversial thing to do. In writing new rules to suit a technology, we might write other people out of roads, and so there are some really difficult social choices to be made there. Let me just end with some final points about responsible innovation. So we've seen when it comes to technology that even though there have been some performative efforts to try to hold big tech to account, right? There has been an unwillingness on the part of governments in Britain, the US, and elsewhere to write rules that constrain big technological companies, which are, they are now the world's biggest companies. So this was when Mark Zuckerberg famously didn't come to the Digital Culture, Media and Sport Committee in 2018, right? And so it's a sort of choice, a societal choice, that we let technology companies organize their irresponsibility in various ways, because we tend to privilege innovation and wait and see for the effects of innovation. The work that I and others have been doing with research funders and others has sort of been trying to come up with a more alert, a more engaged alternative to try to build something that looks like a model of responsible innovation. And here I think university researchers are absolutely vital. And I'll just end on this point, which is to say that, for anybody at universities working with technologies, developing technologies, right, there are all sorts of questions that we can ask about our own work that will help upstream consideration of the sorts of questions that we know that downstream become hugely important. So that's what we were trying to do when we wrote this framework for the EPSRC. And in some aspects, it's starting to make a difference. So let me just end there. I hope that hasn't gone on too much, Philip. I'm going to stop sharing, and I look forward to hearing what the others say.
That's perfect. Thank you, Jack. And thank you for setting up the problem for us, in a sense, in a lovely way with those illustrations. Fantastic. Next up, we have Professor Sabine Braun, a Professor of Translation Studies and Director of the Centre for Translation Studies here at Surrey, and also now one of the co-directors of Surrey's newly established Institute for People-Centred AI. Her research explores the integration and interaction of human and machine in translation and interpreting, especially to improve access to critical information, media content, and vital public services. For over 10 years, she's led a research program that investigates the delivery of translation interpreting services via video link, for example, in legal proceedings, to improve access to language support in the public sector. In addition, she's investigating the feasibility of semi-automating video description, so that's video to text translation, as a way to improve media access for a diverse audience, which is also the topic of her talk today, Personalising Media for Visually Impaired People, the case for automating video descriptions. Over to you, Sabine.
Thank you very much, Philip. So let me also share my screen. So is that visible to you all? Good. Thank you very much. Yes. As Philip has said, I work in translation studies and with a focus on translation, sort of to give access to services, to media content. And for me, that's important to emphasize here. Translation is not just transfer between languages, but it's also transfer between different modalities or modes of communication. For example, as I will discuss today, describing content of a video clip in words, translating video into text, to make it accessible for, in this case, for visually impaired audiences as a way of personalizing this. So my talk is very much more about an example of a sort of project. In that sense, it's a little bit different, but I think the ideas that are underlying this will very much complement what Jack has outlined in his very interesting talk a minute ago. So the type of translation that I'm talking about here is called audio description or video description in the US. And it's offered on TV, on DVD, Blu-ray, on catch-up services. So it's also in museums. It's already quite widely used. And there has also been increasing legislation to increase its availability for audiovisual content like films, for example. A video description is usually very carefully inserted in between the gaps when there is no film dialogue, also no song lyrics and similar, to make sure that it doesn't overlap with other information that visually impaired people want. I will play a little clip for those of you who haven't really come across this to simply demonstrate to you what this is like.
Good riddance.
She dusts off her hands and steps out of her brown court shoes. She picks up a basket of Disney toys and stuffs them into a wardrobe.
How old do you think I am? 5 years old or something.
She picks up Disney's Winnie the Pooh.
Oh, AA, Milne. Oh, sleepless test. Duck, dog, out.
She stuffs every single one of the toys into the wardrobe.
So I think you get the idea. So it's a service for visually impaired. It's a tool to personalize media. But as you can see here, it's also from the person's point of view who does this, the audio or video describer. It needs skills in sort of excellent analytical skills, if you like, in quickly capturing what is really the essence, because you have to be very selective. You can never describe everything that you see in those images. It requires linguistic and narrative skills to do this translation between the modes. So it's a highly skilled activity. And now, of course, comes sort of the dilemma here for the audiences, is that in view of the audiovisual content boom that we are experiencing, where we have audiovisual media everywhere, of course, also especially on social media, where you see more and more of smaller video clips, that there is not only insufficient legislation to actually make this type of video content also accessible, but there is also a lack of resources to make all of this accessible, given the kind of very specialized skill that is. So the question, so to say, for research, and I'm cutting this a little bit short here, very quickly bringing this to technology. There are, I think, many other questions in between, but the broader question is, of course, how we can, despite all these challenges, make media more personalized and more accessible for people with diverse needs, including people with audio, with visual description needs. And yes, the question for us here has been, how can audio automation be used to achieve that? And then, as I will illustrate also, I mean, the challenges also really raise this question: how can we shape the automation or the algorithms that are used to make this yes, a meaningful and fair and equitable service? So what we did in the project, we were fortunate enough to were involved in a European project that has recently ended, where this type of visual accessibility was one of the things that we explored. So this is very much teamwork. One of my co-workers, Kim Starr, is also here in the audience today. So what we did there was, our main goal there was to compare human ways of describing with machine-generated ways of describing, so that we can see what are differences and how machine descriptions can be informed by what we can learn from how human describers go about this task. So initially we experimented a bit with, this is some years ago now, but we collected some very short video clips. We used these film clips that I just showed you, not social media, because we wanted content that has already been video described, so that we have that already as data that we can analyze. Then, of course, in addition, we also created our own description of these as another baseline or ground truth. And then, yes, we started experimenting with machine description. So the first output of these machine descriptions, I've given you one example here. A man is cutting a banana in a room. That was always our starting point. So that's, of course, not really a description that is appropriate here. For those of you who are less familiar with this, the key issues here are that the data that are used to train computers to come up with these descriptions are normally crowdsourced. So that means they are going to large image data banks, like, for example, the COCO data set from Microsoft, and where these images are captioned or described by crowd workers. This is done quite quickly, and usually there are several descriptions for the computer to learn from. But as often with such large training data sets, the quality isn't always very satisfactory. In addition, of course, the computer vision algorithms that are reading those, if you like, and matching the patterns are not so precise yet. And language generation here also means that the accuracy is not really, of course, comparable to the human accuracy here at all yet. So, and in addition, most of these attempts or most of these methods at the moment, they are focused more on describing individual images. So that's why these descriptions are also rather fragmented. So it's still very difficult for a computer to actually create the kind of narrative that we want when we really want to understand the story that is behind these little video clips here. So what we also, but what is of course in our context, in contrast to all this very important, is that we aim for high quality descriptions, because if we think here in the context of media accessibility needs, such needs can only be met. And I think fairness and trust, all those topics that we have here for the panel today, can only be achieved if this access is also meaningful. So if it is a high quality description. Otherwise, I think what is at stake here, I mean, Jack earlier gave this interesting example of these high stake cases. I think otherwise, what is at stake here is the digital inclusion of everyone in our society. So that's why we also have to get those things really right. So what we also immediately realized that we cannot immediately perhaps aim for video descriptions for the purpose of being used by visually impaired people. An interim step is to create video content descriptions that are simpler, for example, video content descriptions that can be used for archive retrieval purposes in broadcast archives. So where they will basically be read by a search engine to find and reuse certain media. So that's a simple step, and much of our project actually has then focused on that simpler step as a way towards a goal that is, I think, much further away, these video descriptions for visually impaired audiences. So our main step, as I said, was to analyze both human and machine generated descriptions. So we've created a much larger sample, 500 of these extracts that I've shown us, not meant to be a training data set in the sense of these large training data sets for computer vision, but for us to see, yes, to highlight the differences. And also I'm referring back to Jack here again as well. In principle, we wanted to study a bit of the failure, because it is of course clear that we can learn from that. So we wanted to see what is different in the machine descriptions and what tends to go wrong there, and explore the why as far as possible, despite the black box effect that is of course very difficult to know why ultimately. But what we looked at is one aspect we looked at is of course the language. So we are language translation people. I'm giving you some very quick examples. One thing that springs out here immediately is that the language used in the machine description is, as we call that, lexically poor. So there is a very, very small number of words that has a very high frequency in this data. So that ultimately the outcome is that leads to a much less interesting, much less varied narrative in terms of word choice. What you can also see in the machine description list, one overused word is talk. So our machine often described what people are doing as talking, whilst we actually, when you watch a film, it's clear that often people are talking to each other, and that is in fact the least relevant action. What is much more relevant is what they are talking about and what else they are doing while they are talking, and so the computer has also picked out, is also not yet very good at picking out salient or relevant points here. Many other things. So here I'm showing you on the right hand side here, you can quickly see the machine description that the machine has come up with for the video clip I showed you earlier. So there are many points. You can also read this. Clearly, the situation or sort of location recognition is problematic here. It's even described as a picture of a woman. The computer has no sense of where that actually takes place. There is no character recognition or re-recognition. It always starts again with a man, a woman. So there's of course also gender recognition problems in this data. There's often also gender bias, that it's sort of, the first description is often a man when it's actually a woman. The action labeling is quite decontextualized, as I said, and it also seems that the woman's facial expression or her body language are not fully analyzed, so that's not taken into account. The main objects are either misdescribed. There's lots of teddy bears and bananas and mirrors in there, even though that's not really part of it. Whereas on the other hand, objects that are salient, like the cupboard in which she stuffs all those toys, they are not actually described. So in summary, what is at the moment, what is actually necessary, because it's also very clear, I should add that as well, and that there's a lot of potential here. So the main reason for me to outline the issues here was not to talk down sort of the effort that has already gone into that from the computer vision community. But I think what are reasonable next steps here is that we look at the issues that I have listed here again, and that have currently gone wrong, and what our role in the project was also to make some recommendations of other things that could be looked at and then test them out, which has happened partly in our project, although not fully yet. So to improve the quality of these descriptions. So, and that means we need to look at more than object recognition. So of course, object recognition remains very important, and it needs to become more accurate, but we also looked at whether speech recognition can be used to listen to the film dialogue, for example, especially then to combine that, that you can filter out keywords that are there, and whether that can then combine with what the computer can see, so that the description can be made more accurate. Also, some of our project partners experimented with sort of automatically recognizing the topic in the video clips, or topic changes rather, or key moments in the video clips, so that we can move this towards a more narrative structure. And I will shorten this a little bit. Emotion detection can perhaps be used despite all its question marks. Face recognition similarly is a technology that has moved along quite fast. Again, none of these technologies are without issues, but all of them could perhaps be combined to make this description be based on a much more broader basis, so to say, so that it's becoming more accurate. Certainly, one of the most difficult things for the machine are still sort of to find the narrative structure. So this is something we are also working on at the moment, to see whether whether this narrative segmentation can be improved, and whether the narrative cohesion, so linking different parts of the film clip, can actually be improved. Yeah, I don't think I've mentioned them all, but you can see them here. So very much quickly to close this off, what we think next steps can be here is clearly we need a much more multimodal approach, not just computer vision and not just focusing on one modality, but using everything that there is, also using, of course, prior knowledge. I was showing that earlier, knowledge graphs could be integrated into this to make this more semantically rich. What we have also experimented is, and this is something I find very important, is that we try the semi-automation, that we keep the human in the loop. We've tried to get people to post-edit these machine descriptions. That's of course also still challenging because of the quality, but that is one way to go and to improve this, at least as an intermediate step, to say we take the machine descriptions and we edit them as human beings. And finally, I have talked here about the visual or the personalization and accessibility needs for visually impaired audiences, but clearly we also have a lot of other audiences that will need some kind of assistance to fully access audiovisual content, to be better at emotion recognition, or also, for example, to improve cognitive access by simplifying the texts that they are reading or hearing around it. So we need to also broaden this view on accessibility and address a much wider need of diverse audiences. So I stop here. That was one example of what could be done in this particular accessibility area of personalizing media. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Sabina. Fascinating examples of things that are working and things that are to be worked on there. So I think just to break things up a little bit, we have a few minutes maybe when we can have a couple of questions. So if members of the audience would like to pop a question into the chat, feel free, or if any of the panelists want to jump in, please do. Maybe I'll start off, Jack, by throwing one over to you. I thought, I was thinking, reflecting a bit on how these questions of safety translate to the issue of media and media personalization. And I guess, yes, I mean, in the last month, there've been some interesting stories in relation to this, I guess. But I wondered, maybe you could give us a bit of an idea or an insight about how the view of safety that an engineer might have could be quite different from that of a user, or how it might be that the technologist's measures of safety might be different from a user's view of safety. Do you have any comment on that?
Yeah, thanks, Philip. So I think two things. One is a sort of perennial question that happens at the intersection of engineering and social science that can be boiled down, I guess, to how safe is safe enough, right? And whenever we have a new technology, engineers may be able to build a safety case for that technology and hope that satisfies regulators. But evidence from the history of technology is that members of the public might not be convinced, and that public trust is not just something that can be assumed. And in my area, looking at transport technologies, the obvious difference is between the safety record of cars and the safety record of trains and planes, where, in sort of broad brush terms, trains and planes are about 100 times safer than cars. And so the question when it comes to something like a self-driving car will be, well, what are the public likely to tolerate? There might be a sort of utilitarian view, which is, occasionally expressed by some engineers, which says, well, if these technologies save even one life on aggregate, then we should encourage them. Now, my guess is that because of the nature of the technologies and all that we know about risk perception, that members of the public will expect one or two orders of magnitude improvements in safety before these things are even vaguely considered acceptable. So the how safe is safe enough question, we tend to have quite a lot of disagreement between, social science, the public, engineers, the people selling the technology. But I think there's something else that Sabine, raised really interestingly in her talk, which is about whether automated systems themselves can be trusted to know when something really matters. And I think this is something that we've seen quite a lot from our sort of algorithmic war stories, when, as well as the examples that Sabine mentioned of sort of gendering or misgendering people and not knowing whether or how that matters, right? And we've seen it in image recognition, where we've had, embarrassing cases when Google Images was labeling Black people as gorillas, and a web developer pointed this out to them and generated a really important discussion about, not just the representation within Google that leads to these sorts of problems, but also whether these systems will ever know what they're doing in such a way as they know why that's controversial, right? And so there's something really important about when we're automating the process of risk assessment. We need to, and that might just be small things, like occasionally mistaking a man for a woman in a video. But in any case, it might not know why that does or doesn't matter, which means that the potential for controversy is absolutely enormous.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. I'm just going to throw one now across to Sabina. So I thought it was interesting that you mentioned about cognitive access or accessibility. I thought that's quite an interesting area that's perhaps underexplored at the moment. And in relation to that, I was particularly thinking about how do we recognize all the stakeholders, when a technology such as a media personalization technology is put out there. I wondered if you had any thought about that.
That's quite a mission to. Well, first of all, thank you. It is very. that the question itself, I find it very important to first of all even point out that such research we need to do with stakeholders. So as our project was very early step in understanding what's happening there, but certainly our next steps involve potential users of this, or the people who also mediate between the users and so yes, you need to first of all you need to involve them all. I think we also need to then be clear for which user group we do this, because there are two levels here. On the one hand, what I said also at the end of my talk, accessibility for me is a very wide concept. It's not just one particular group. We all have, and it's certainly not just disabled people, or we all have accessibility needs in one way or another, be it accessing something in a foreign language. I haven't touched on that here, but that's a completely different example. So, but at the same time, whilst we need to bear that in mind, it's also, of course, clear that we then need to identify the needs of different groups differently and need to be very specific about that. So that is why also I think that this kind of research, unfortunately, I think it will progress relatively slowly, because it's the meticulous work in the detail. What are the needs of different groups? So yes, these various diverse cognitive access needs that people have. We are actually looking at that in our group at the moment to see how we can broaden this research. But as I said, there is no one-size-fits-all approach, so you have to be quite specific. One point that is important also when it comes to stakeholders is, of course, to listen to the audiences, the end users, but it's also in our case very much to listen to and to learn from and work with those who traditionally produce those descriptions. So in our case here, for example, audio describers or video describers or other types of language and translation professionals. And that brings another really important question, namely that of, are we going to replace you? So in translation, this is like in many other professions nowadays. Jack has hinted at it at the beginning. There is this, it's the world of jobs, the world of work is changing. So are we replacing those people? And then why would they work with us if ultimately we are aiming at replacing them? So we are not. I think this is an area also, this whole language description, that is complex, that will certainly need the human input for a long time. And so our approach is also always to say, is there the complementarity? Can we learn from what professional describers are doing, not to replace what they are doing? So they are working for TV, they are working for films, full-length feature films, far too complex. But can we use that knowledge and combine it with machine methodologies to automate or semi-automate in those areas where a human describer wouldn't be able to cover it? So, and that goes back to the social media, all the small video clips on the TikToks and the whatnots, what you have, where certainly there is either a machine approach probably or nothing much else. And so those are the areas that we need to look at.
Yeah, it's very important to notice those other stakeholders too. Thank you for bringing up the producers as well. Just a quick note, in the chat there is a mention of a cross-government algorithmic transparency standard that you may want to have a look at or contribute some comments to. That's commented there in the chat. If I don't see any other questions, or if anyone else, unless anyone else is happy to jump in, I'll then move on to our third talk. John Colomos, who's a professor of computer vision at the Centre for Vision, Speech and Signal Processing, which is one of the UK's largest academic research groups for artificial intelligence, with approaching 200 researchers. John is also a visiting professor at Adobe Research, Creative Intelligence Lab in California, but has also spent periods of time working in IBM, with Vodafone, with Hewlett Packard, and also has had a Royal Academy of Engineering Fellowship. He leads the Digital Creativity Lab at CVSSP, focusing on interaction of computer vision, graphics, and AI for the creative industries, and intuitive visual search, such as using Sketch, and heads up the Surrey blockchain activity, exploring the fusion of AI and distributed ledger technologies. And I think this brings us on directly to the Decade project, with which John is very heavily involved. And I hope he'll tell us a little bit more about this decentralization now. Over to you, John.
Thank you, Philip, for the introduction and for asking me along this morning. So good morning, everybody. This morning, I'd like to give you a brief introduction to Decade, our Centre for the Decentralised Digital Economy, and in particular, give you a little bit of information about what we're doing at the interface of the creative industries with media, and also with personalised media, to the topic of today's workshop. So just briefly, Decade is a virtual research centre. It's led out of Surrey, also partnering with the University of Edinburgh and the Digital Catapult. And we're actually a cross-disciplinary research centre. We combine not just an AI research centre, which I'm based in, which is CVSSP, but also a business school, a cybersecurity centre, an institute for design informatics, and a school of law. So across this landscape, we conduct socio-technical research into what we term the decentralized digital economy. So what do we mean by that? Well, we all live today in a decentralized digital economy. We engage in the digital economy, and anyone can be a producer or consumer of digital goods or services. If you think about it, I could take an Uber, or I could drive an Uber, I could rent my flat out in Airbnb, or I could go rent a flat. But these kind of dynamic peer-to-peer opportunities are all taking place through centralized digital platforms. And that can be a problem because often the end users and stakeholders don't have a say in the governance decisions of those centralized platforms. And we see, everyday stories about how decisions are made on the operation of these platforms in which our digital economy is based that can have unintended or adverse consequences. So Decade is exploring how basically emerging data-driven technologies like distributed ledger and blockchain and AI are going to transform our digital economy in the future through the creation of decentralized platforms through which these engagements take place. And we've chosen to focus initially upon the creative industries because content creation and consumption are already highly decentralized, but mediated, of course, by centralized platforms like the YouTubes and so on of the world. And Decade is really exploring how decentralized platforms can help us do things like trace content provenance, ensure media authenticity, help us trade content in a decentralized way, even change the way that content and media is produced. And I'll touch on some of that today. So before I do, let me just briefly just introduce a bit of terminology. I mean, what do I mean by a distributed ledger? So a distributed ledger is like a way of storing data, a data store that you can add data to, but once added, that data is immutable. It can't change, and you can't delete it even. So it's kind of analogous to a journal or a ledger for financial bookkeeping. You can add an entry, but you can't go back and change entries or remove entries, right? So that's what a ledger is. We're all familiar with that. A distributed ledger simply means it's a shared data structure maintained by multiple parties on a network around the world. Now, there are many ways to implement a distributed ledger, and we call these collectively distributed ledger technologies, or DLT. Blockchain is just one example of this. And there are lots of many ways that you can create such a distributed data store. So what's special about DLT? Well, the idea is that it's unique in that it enables multiple independent parties that don't necessarily trust one another. They might even act adversarially towards one another to collaborate to produce a shared trusted data store, a ledger. And the keywords here are trust and independence. So by trusted data, we mean that all the parties can be assured of the immutability of the data. And in many cases, also the provenance of the data, a point I'll keep coming back to today. In other words, who created it, who did what to it. So in other words, the DLT is giving us a tamper-proof distributed data store. And the critical thing with DLT is it enables that guarantee of immutability, that tamper-proofing, to be made without recourse to any centralized point of trust, either a physical point of trust like a server, or like a logical point of trust like a predefined trust list. And that's what makes DLT unique, that decentralized trust model. So, the first example of one of these DLTs is blockchain, which was proposed originally as a technology that underpins Bitcoin. And Bitcoin, as we all know now, is a decentralized kind of digital currency called a cryptocurrency, the unit of which is Bitcoins. And of course, these Bitcoins are not coins, they're digital tokens that markets have emerged to create value around. And the job of the DLT here is to track who owns what tokens, what coins. That's the shared record, the shared data, without recourse to a centralized authority like a central bank. So, blockchain then exhibits these two core properties of DLT. It guarantees the integrity, in other words, the immutability of shared data across independent, non-trusting parties. but it does so without reliance upon a centralized authority. Okay, so one of the key points I raised there is provenance. DLT enables us to say something about the provenance or origins of data. And that ends up having a number of interesting use cases with respect to media and the creative industries. One of the early projects that we explored the intersection of blockchain for media provenance was in a project we called Archangel, which is a project in collaboration with the National Archives and Open Data Institute. And the idea here was to safeguard the integrity of national archives, such as the UK National Archive, by storing digital fingerprints or digests of media, like video in this case, onto a blockchain. Now, remember, when data is stored on a blockchain, you can never change it. It's immutable. You can't change it. You can't delete it. So the idea here was to have the archive fingerprint content as it was ingested into its care, store that fingerprint on the blockchain, and then when that content is released later to the public, because records may be closed in the case of National Archives for some years, then the members of the public could fingerprint that content again, compare it to what was on the blockchain, and check that it hadn't been tampered with. And it could be used as a tool also by the archivists themselves. And we rolled out a feasibility trial of this technology across actually 5 different national archives around the world, not just the UK National Archive, but also the Australian, the US NARA, a North American Records Agency, and Estonia and Norway. And the idea here was the archives around the world were all mutually underwriting the integrity of each other's content without a centralized point of trust, but also it was open and transparent and enabled people to prove the provenance of the media stored within that archive. So this was a move then away from like an institutional model of trust, which is, trust me, I'm the National Archives, to a technological underscoring of trust enabled by blockchain. So moving forward, we started to consider how this kind of technology, fingerprinting content using, for example, AI technologies, robust AI technologies, and blockchain for the immutability and provenance might be applied to other problems. And a problem we turned to was that of ensuring the integrity of media. So fighting, for example, misinformation and fake news disseminated online. And, one of many links between that project and this is, some of the earliest examples of fake news. So when we started our project, we had a tour of the National Archives and came across this proclamation against false news. So just showing that this is actually not a problem created by the digital age, but actually a societal problem going back many centuries. But of course, with the advent of photography and later on, of course, digital photography and the internet, we see that this problem has been exacerbated by the ease through which media may be digitally manipulated and also reshared online. And these are just a snapshot of some stories in the last half of this year that have kind of highlighted the severity of the issue of fake news and misinformation online. Okay, so what can we do about this? Well, there are already some emerging solutions in the industry space. So there's a cross-industry consortium called C2PA, which is effectively developing an open standard that is targeted for cross-industry adoption, that is looking at how an audit trail recording the provenance of a media item, so like who created what was done to it, can be embedded within the metadata of, for example, an image. And this is a technology that is backed by a number of commercial players, and there are also other similar sort of standards being developed by, for example, the JPEG group. But one open challenge that remains with these standards that are based around metadata is, of course, that metadata can be stripped out of images, and indeed this happens routinely as content is shared on social media platforms. And of course, an attacker might take an image and strip out the metadata and replace it with a different provenance trail. So one of the solutions that we've been exploring in collaboration with Adobe and other partners in this consortium has been to explore how, again, this idea of AI-based fingerprinting can be used to identify pieces of content and then match that content back to a record of the provenance of that media item stored immutably within something like a distributed ledger. So I can give you a brief preview now of a demo that we are going to present next week, actually, at the CVMP conference in London, that shows this system in action. So you can see here that we have a video, and what this interface is doing here is allowing us to, just for test purposes, crop out a small section of that video and add some kind of distortions to it that, perhaps in this case, it's degrading the quality of that video and adding some noise, which you might expect the content to do as it's being reshared around the internet. And you can see here the system has then matched that piece of content back out of 100,000 videos to the original content. So, okay, so that's one area of Decade's activity, is exploring this idea of decentralized kind of repository for provenance information. But we're also exploring what downstream applications provenance might, secure media provenance might enable. And one interesting one is a future of content trading. So what would a decentralized framework look like for exchanging and purchasing content? And we've probably all seen in the media, particularly over the last 12 to 18 months, the rise of NFTs, non-fungible tokens, which is a way of basically creating a digital token that represents a piece of artwork on the blockchain, on DLT. And this idea of an NFT, a piece of crypto artwork having value based on its provenance is not actually a new one. It can be traced back to analog artwork. There are these things called catalogue raisonné, where you have a kind of a physical ledger, often in Paris, that records the provenance of a piece of physical artwork, and that's what kind of gives a piece of artwork its value versus, say, a print of that artwork that I might own in my house that might be nearly worthless. So, NFT is like the digital version of that. It's a ledger, but this time on a blockchain, that records the provenance of a digital asset. And you can do very interesting things with these, like, for example, code business logic into the asset so that when it's bought and sold, the original creator gets a percentage profit, which actually you can't do with analog artwork. So there's some really interesting opportunities there. But there are also issues. I mean, NFTs are by a long way off a perfect solution to this content trading problem. A non-exhaustive list of the issues that NFTs have are things like, you can misappropriate content, you can copy paste the content and sell it again. And we think, for example, this fingerprinting solution on blockchain might be a solution to that. There's also the issue of the legal space around NFT and rights associated with NFT. If you purchase an NFT, what rights do you have to make derivative works from it? That's very much a gray area now, but perhaps again, there's a way of sort of signing rights into this provenance information as the NFTs are bought and sold to enable some sort of statement of rights to be made. Of course, the issues a number of people will be quick to highlight are the climate and energy costs of blockchain technologies, and there are solutions that are actually being innovated out of the NFT space, like layer 2 solutions and proof of stake networks that are becoming a lot more popular actually due to the cost of trading NFTs. And that's really kind of reducing the energy footprint of blockchain quite significantly and should provide solutions to this. And then, other issues people have flagged are things like the way these are traded on centralized markets is not ideal. There are things called decentralized autonomous organizations that are currently used for cryptocurrency trading that could be used to similarly trade NFTs without this reliance on centralized markets. The issues of searching content and so on are also problematic at the moment. And we have a project in Decade at the moment where one of our PhD students exploring how we can analyze the style of NFTs and try to automatically price them in order to create first steps towards a decentralized marketplace. Looking further into the future, very briefly, I just like to sort of highlight a few opportunities. I mean, today, things like fingerprinting and near duplicate detection are being used for things like copyright control. But in the future, that kind of provenance information and the ability to attribute content back to source might be, enabling entirely new ways of producing content. So, for example, imagine people go out and shoot content of a gig, and there might be a media producer, like a TV broadcaster agency that wants to produce a documentary of that gig. Well, perhaps users could receive micropayments for the use of their content, because using these kinds of technologies, that that media, that personal media, can be traced back to source in a secure way. And maybe, those kinds of technologies will enable new kinds of autonomous trading floors that would broker content in a kind of new next generation of NFT from decentralized content producers like you and me to other decentralized content consumers. We might even think about entirely new models of rights, where perhaps the rights over how an image is used is dictated not by who took the picture, but by who's actually in it. And that might even enable us to tackle some of the privacy issues around resharing of media, of personal media, that we see on social platforms today. These kinds of ideas are emerging, not just out of our centre, but being talked about in a number of places. One idea, data trust, was coined by Open Data Institute a few years ago, basically as a legal structure that provides kind of stewardship of data, which here could include personalised media. And we've seen a few prototypes of that, both here at Surrey and elsewhere around the UK in EPSRC funded projects and digital economy funded projects. Things like the HAT, the Hub of All Things, Databox, and a project Come Here that we ran, which basically was exploring how wearable healthcare data could be kind of traded on the blockchain to data consumers like healthcare providers in return for micropayments to the user. And the idea there was to move away from this kind of monolithic centralized model where someone like a fitness band manufacturer might sort of hoard your data and resell it, which is kind of the current business model, to one in which there's a decentralized platform for brokering and extracting value from that data to the individual, which gives users better agency over who they want to trade their data with. They get paid for their data and they get to opt out as well. So yeah, I'm happy to take questions now or hold till later, depending on Philip's plan. That's all I have for now.
Lovely, thank you, John. Let's move on and get our fourth speaker in first, and then I'd like to encourage people to post questions in the chat. I see there's already been some discussion there. That's very welcome, and hopefully we'll get some discussion together at the end. Thank you, John. So next we have Eleni Sharp, Executive Product Manager for Innovation within BBC R&D, who's been there for almost 10 years, launching products to millions of users. And most recently, she's been working in BBC R&D, working on innovation projects such as immersive and hyper-personalized content and personal data stores. So she's going to share her work on this topic of the personal data stores today, explaining the approach, the research program, and what's next. Over to you, Eleni.
Thanks, Philip. Hi, everybody. Yeah, so my name's Eleni. I'm Exec Product Manager in BBC Research and Development. So I'm going to talk to you today just a little bit about the work we've been doing over the past 18 months with personal data stores. So this is the vision that we've set ourselves. So we've been exploring personal data stores and testing our ideas out with audiences. We're really focused on the user experience, putting customers at the centre of that. It's all completely cutting edge technology. And of course, because we're R&D, it's all a few steps into the future. And the reason we're doing this now is because we're in an emerging data crisis, and this crisis is growing every day. This data was from last year, and it really seems quite conservative now. I know definitely more than 39 different organisations have got my data, and that's probably the same for the majority of us, I'd have thought. But we really think we can turn this crisis into an opportunity if we do it right. We've spoken to audiences, and we know that there's really low levels of public trust. There's a need for greater control, and actually they are quite open to using a personal data store. And there's loads going on in the industry as well. So recently TikTok was in the news, as well as the NHS, both involved in really controversial personal data practices. And audiences are taking steps to do things differently. So for example, the Flanders government, we've been working with them, and they're just about to give all their citizens personal data pods. And Google has just announced some radical changes this year to how it manages its cookies using something called Flock. So what exactly have we been doing? So kind of four main strands of work. The first one is building out technical prototypes which combine live data, which I'm going to show you a demo of in a minute. We also built some UX prototypes which kind of show additional profiles and dashboards. We've also started to think about what personal data store native apps could be. So these could be new services, or they could enhance existing services. And we've been thinking about education around data. So what is personal data? What's a personal data store? And how do we start to explain these concepts to our audiences? And we've also had loads of press coverage recently as well. So we had a piece in Wired, we were published a blog, we were in the Times and the Register as well, which has generated so much interest from companies and people wanting to get in touch, which has been fantastic. So we've been speaking to people like DCMS, NHS, lots of startups, even IKEA. So you can really see that there's kind of a lot of movement happening in this space, and there's like a real ecosystem growing of the willing. So to bring it to life to you a little bit, I'm just going to show you one of our UX prototypes now. This one's called My PDS.
My PDS allows you to see all of your data all in one place. Your data is organized into simple profiles. That might include the things you've watched and listened to, an overview of where you're spending and saving your money, and critical data about your health and well-being. My PDS brings this data together by connecting your apps and services. Once you can see your data, you can make sure it really does reflect you. So you'll get more tailored and personalized experiences. My PDS can also help you use your data in new ways. It gives you access to new types of services that can help with self-improvement, contribute to the common good, or just allow you to use your data to have more fun. You decide who sees your data. You can change who has access to it at any point, keeping it safe and secure at all times. Be part of a change where you and not businesses control your data. My PDS. See, explore, and use your data.
Okay, so let's have a look at My PDS app. So this is our kind of personal data store platform, a little bit more detail. So I'm going to show you a slice of what we built and how we pulled in Netflix and BBC and Spotify data. I'm going to chicken out of doing a live demo though, and I'll show you one we made earlier from one of my brilliant colleagues called Hannah's.
I'll be showing you and our My PDS app. Your journey starts with an install for PDS in our Sounds app. This links to an app store where you can select your PDS app. Now, once installed, you create data store or pod. Now, we work with operational privacy and legal on the language here to really reflect our commitment to privacy by design. The first choice for user is where you keep your pod. In this case, that could be BBC or Inrupt. Now, Inrupt is the company set up by Tim Berners-Lee, who we've been working with, and we'll choose Inrupt. I sign in and then explicitly connect the pod to my PDS. Once connected, I need to get some data. So the next steps is to decide which accounts to connect to bring in a user's media consumptions. Now, we really think this will be a vibrant ecosystem. So for the demonstrator, we build connectors for BBC, Spotify, and Netflix. I'll connect my BBC data first. When connected, I also get to see a full detail of what data and how often it will be accessed. So I'll do this for all the sources that I want, and then I can go ahead and create a profile, which will take me to the My PDS application. So my profile has been set. Let me show you the My PDS app. There's a number of key concepts. First, profiles, which bring together all your data relating to a particular topic or activity, which could be media, finance, or health. The dashboard, which offers an overview of the data held in the pod and generates some insights to the user. In accounts, you can manage and remove them and the data that comes with them. And finally, there are apps for PDS-powered purposes or for specific activities. Let me explain profiles a bit more. Within a profile, you can see which data sources power it and what apps want to use it. So I'll give Sounds access to my media profile. You immediately see that this has been actions and Sounds is accessing my profile. Profiles give user controls over how the apps see them. This here I can include, for example, or exclude artists that I want to have as part of my profile. Same with a podcast that I've been listening to, or my TV shows from iPlayer. Here clearly you can see that some of these have been watched by my kids. So let's see what sounds actually looks like when powered by a PDS. And what you're seeing now is the recommendations being driven by the artists that are brought in from Spotify and matching against our catalog. We also bring in external data, in this case from Skiddle, which promotes local events. Here, my postcode, which is stored in my core file, is used to find events close to me based on the artists in my profile. We think that with capabilities like this, we can enhance our existing products and make them more relevant for our users.
Thank you, Hannes. Here are the components that we've built for my PDS, but there's a much larger ecosystem to consider, which we started doing as well. So this is the view of the overall public service data ecosystem that we've designed, and it's got multiple players across kind of commercial, public sector, and also non-profit organisations. So for us to be able to kind of test our hypothesis about the BBC's role, we had to prototype services and a platform to support them. And this space is so kind of vast, and the service and platform we've created, they're absolutely nowhere near complete. But in order for us to kind of know what the BBC should build, buy, outsource, or just actually completely ignore, we've tried to tackle as much as we can. And we've done all this building out from a core of a solid personal data store. And we've been working with lots of different partners. So these range from big tech, so like Google and Microsoft, to startups as well, and also established brands such as NatWest and the NHS. And we developed a research program to test our thinking. So we worked with the agency Youth Site, and we spoke to over 3,500 people in a variety of ways. At the heart of this program was an online community. So we did an online community spread across 10 days, and we included the live trial as part of it. And as part of that, the participants actually added all their own data and used the prototypes. And throughout the 10 days, we did one-to-one interviews and focus groups with the participants as well. And there's 4 kind of things that came out really clearly from this. The first one was we just kept hearing the phrase "in too deep" time and time again. So people, they wanted help managing their data, but they just didn't know where to start. And the vast majority of people were really open to using a personal data store. They all thought it was much better than the current situation. The third one was that people said that seeing the data visually come to life was a key benefit, and that was something that they hadn't seen before. So that was seen as a real USP of the product. And of course, having visibility on who collects and shares and uses your data is extremely important to the participants. And we really believe this is really transformational work with huge opportunities for the BBC, the industry, and the audience as well. So it provides groundbreaking new ways to make data a force for good by letting users decide how information about them is used to make decisions and predictions. It also supports the creation of common metadata descriptions, just for the BBC, but also for the sector as a whole. And this then enables data strategies to enhance our existing products and also develop new types of services, which is really exciting. At the BBC, we want to go beyond best practices for data management. We want to put the BBC at the forefront of shaping this emergent data economy. So I'm just going to share a couple of the things that we're doing next. So the first one is we're looking at some watch parties. The watch parties with audiences are growing year on year, and especially with lockdown, there's a real peak in these, but actually that trend has continued. So we're now thinking, how might we enhance a group watching experience with a personal data store? And we're looking to build something and launch this in the spring of next year. We've also been working with children's, thinking about an opportunity to build out a children's media profile and thinking about what that might look like, what sort of content mix would be in that, what sort of data would be included in there, and how might this then help grow with children within the BBC over time. And then the final one is we're looking at funding opportunities to accelerate our developments. So we've just led on the submission of an £8 million bid for Horizon Europe with a consortium of 8 other European partners. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Eleni. Wonderful. It's lovely to hear about some of these things in the pipeline as well, and to get them while they're just, before they're happening, as it were, get an early view on these things. I think we have some time now for a bit of discussion. I think just to kind of get things going, maybe some questions. I have a question for each of you, Eleni and John, who've just spoken. So Eleni, just while you're here, maybe I'll ask you first. So I guess a lot of the output of the use of these personal data stores in the context of BBC's use, I suppose, is aiming at better recommendation services for one thing, as one of the forms of personalization that's on offer. And I was trying to think about how we measure a good recommender. And I know that BBC's also been involved in looking at new ways of trying to measure performance, in terms of human values and so on. And I wondered if you had any insights in that direction to open our eyes, open our minds to different ways of scoring things up rather than just how many likes or hits did I get.
Yeah, definitely. And it's a bit of a balance, isn't it? Because in R&D, we've developed this human values framework, which is like, how do we measure value beyond just, how many views did it get? What's the engagement metrics? So we're kind of looking at combining that. And I think the important thing is it doesn't need to be either or. So we're looking at how we can kind of combine those together. But I think to measure our recommendations, and we actually haven't done this yet, this is something that we need to do, but I would really be interested in doing kind of a straight A/B test. Because that's kind of the missing link at the moment, really, because at the moment we're showing there's different recommendations. We think they're richer. And also, particularly with the ones that I showed you, the BBC will then, if we put in the Spotify data, we not only know already what kind of radio stations or podcasts people listen to, we then know much more granular details around that, what actual artists they listen to. So we can take that. And then when the BBC's content is more flexible media content, so when it's all kind of cut up into lots of pieces, we've then got so many more options of what segments of content we can show our audiences.
Yeah. Just to jump across to John, I was very interested in what you were introducing at the end there about some of the questions about ownership and the sort of data subject versus the data, who's in the data, like, particular photograph, the photographer who takes it owns the photo, but the person who's in it has some rights in terms of what consents they might give. And I wondered if you could just say a little bit about that interplay between consent and ownership and what rights for use might be supported. Do you have any? Yeah.
Right. It's definitely an open space at the moment and needs a lot more work of a socio-technical nature. Right now, if you look at things like NFT, for example, I mean, NFT is effectively a tokenized form of artwork. Really, what you're doing there is trading like a URL, and basically, you're making a statement about the ownership of that URL, and then trading that statement of ownership. And I think it's not entirely legally solid whether you do even have ownership of that URL, but nevertheless it's the tokenized form of that statement that you're trading. But it's a form of ownership. I mean, it's certainly possible. People have been prosecuted for theft of crypto assets in the UK. So I mean, arguably, there might be some position put that other forms of, if you can steal something, then you must be able to own it. But I mean, going further to rights of use, is currently completely undefined. And I mean, there are some, NFT trading marketplaces that will have, end user agreements that you agree to, but ultimately they're not assertions of rights over specific media items. And actually, in the future, to your point, I mean, you would want a flexible structure in which at the point of sale, if you like, you can define what those rights might be, and then going further, perhaps it should be down to the content of the image rather than necessarily who took it, that might dictate those rights. So I mean, I'm thinking of a sort of a future scenario where you might go to a gig, shoot some footage, and so there might be some producer interested in your piece of footage. And they might discover that footage via some decentralized platform that enables them to search on camera angle or who's in it, or the quality, or even the rights that you determine about the footage that you're producing in your personal media. But then, of course, then there may be other people in that footage, that may have a different view onto whether they want to appear in that production. And then, based on perhaps some sort of AI-based technology, you could identify those rights and factor that into the brokering system that enables that decentralized production to take place. So that's just like a possible future vision of this. It's inspired a little bit by, there was a great project out of Open Lab up in Newcastle called Bootlegger, which is really, really interesting. Several years ago now, I have a sort of HCI group up there, sort of thinking about that kind of crowdsourced scenario, but thinking about what it means to underpin that with strong provenance and a decentralized marketplace and decentralized production platform.
Yeah, so there's a whole world to explore there. It seems still wide open. Jack, you had your hand up. Do you want to come in?
Yeah, if it's okay for, I don't want to stop other people from asking, but I just had, I had questions for both of you, but maybe John, could I just, the stuff about blockchain I find absolutely fascinating, because this is, ostensibly a social science week discussion. I think, it's the purported, the claim, right, that sort of blockchains are a solution to some sort of problems of trust, and they have these sort of interesting libertarian heritage, a sort of skepticism of some of those institutional matters of trust. I think it's really interesting, because whenever there is a purported solution to a social problem, one of the things that social scientists ask is, well, how is that problem being narrowed to suit a particular technology? And I can see with the sorts of things that you're describing that there are some really interesting possible solutions to things like deep fakes, right? So an ability to rebuild some sort of credibility around fractured technological, trust relationships. But I worry that the sort of model of trust that is being deployed here is a very narrow one that basically says, it's trust answering the question of, is it true, right? Whereas trust is also, it's a mutual relationship, right? It's two-way, and it's also about trusting that somebody has your interests at heart, or trusting that an institution has your interests at heart. And I think that bit of trust is not answered by blockchain systems. And I wonder if, we build systems based on blockchains, we'll end up actually having to recreate institutions around them. So for example, for a Bitcoin, and we might end up just reinventing central banks, right? Rather than automating.
There's a lot to be wrapped up in a response to that. I think, first of all, actually, I'm not suggesting that trust equals true. I'm actually trying to suggest a very different position. There are already AI-based technologies out there that will attempt to detect manipulation, benign or otherwise, in an image, and flag that up. Detection systems, deepfake detectors, right? Video authentication systems. They are making automated judgments about a piece of content, and then in order to influence your trust over it. Whereas what I guess we're proposing here is attribution system, right? So we're saying, okay, what we can do is help users make more informed trust decisions about the media they encounter online by providing them secure audit trail of the provenance of that asset. I can tell you that this photographer took it, they took it into this product, manipulated it in this way, used this filter, and here it is. Now you decide if you trust that picture or not. At no point do I tell you you should or you shouldn't trust that. I'm just providing you with more information. And the use of blockchain is enabling me to provide that information in a secure way without recourse to any particular organization. Because if I did that, then you would basically be implicitly shifting the trust onto that organization. Let's say, a tech company decides to operate this system in a centralized way. Then effectively that tech company would become the police for the world's media. And then the question would be, do I trust, the cloud provision of that tech company to be tamper-proof? Do I trust, there were people that wouldn't. So, the idea here is to explore how decentralized platforms rather than centralized platforms, this is really the whole kind of underpinning of the center, is enabling people to trust in data without having to place trust in an institution. It's not about building a new institution to manage this.
Great. I see we have a question from Mark Plumley in the chat. I think, Eleni, maybe you want to take this one. So what should be the limits of personalization? Mark says, sometimes I find I don't want things to be personalized to what another organization thinks I want. I guess ever opting out is a personalization, though.
I think that's
the big off switch.
Yeah, definitely, because you just find yourself in this hole, don't you? And we really found when we were speaking to younger audiences, a lot of them, they didn't really want personalization, and they didn't want recommendations, because they often said that they like to think they were so unique and their taste was so niche that actually there couldn't possibly be recommendations because they wouldn't be right. So that was quite interesting, and that was something that we hadn't come across before. But yeah, I think it's that age-old problem, isn't it? Like how much do you personalize while still giving people variety?
Yes, it is a difficult challenge, and I think some of these controls are things that will need to be evolved, won't they, as we get more control.
Yeah, definitely. And what we've tried to do in the BBC so far is have some level of personalisation, but not all automatic personalisation. So there's always like an editorial curation as part of that as well. So you're getting kind of like different, what you see is kind of different slices of it. So maybe everybody gets kind of 30%. Another percentage is editorially curated, and then another percentage is kind of algorithmically recommended to you.
Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it, that's emerged.
Mm.
I want to try to begin to bring things to a close, and I've got a last question for each of the panelists, and maybe we can try and keep your answers brief. But I guess, we're not in December yet, but entering into a festive spirit, if you could ask Santa for your perfect personalization service in terms of delivering personalized media to you, what would each of you ask for? And we'll go through in the order that you spoke. So Jack, maybe to you first.
Thanks, Philip. So maybe it just follows on directly from what Eleni was just saying. I think it's about there's a sort of transparency need, an urgent one, and it's about being able to know what decisions are being made about us and on what basis. I think will emerge as increasingly important. There are debates at the moment about whether that should be written into British law. I think it's just such an important point, and I think there are issues to do with the explainability of AI as a technical concern, but also the politics of this, right? So Shoshana Zuboff, in her book on surveillance capitalism, talks about a one-way mirror, that our relationship with these technologies is extremely asymmetrical, where they might know everything about us, but we know nothing about how they work. And crucially, to the BBC's efforts to assemble all our data in one place, they might not want us to know anything about how they work, right? They would much rather keep that behind the curtain. So it will be a political battle as well to encourage transparency, but I think it's a vital one.
Great. Well, we'll get the little elves working for you there. Sabina.
Yeah, mine also really follows on from, to some extent, what Eleni has said, but also Jack, so I keep mine short. I think in relation to personalization, my wish would, of course, be for comprehensive accessibility for people with very different needs across the board, informed accessibility, so that people it also goes to what John is saying, people know where things come from, people have a way to meaningfully engage with it, whether they can see or not, whether they can hear or not, or have other access needs. And I see that as a prerequisite for then making informed decisions about personalization. I mean, first of all, you have to have access to everything. And I also think that, we need to keep a balance between this personalization and keeping an open mind, knowing what else is there, so that we don't end up in what also I think Marcus raised, that this sort of extreme personalization that we lose track of everything else that is going on around us.
Yes, good point. John.
Gosh, they were great answers. Mine's going to sound a lot more trivial. I'd just like a great personalized Christmas song list, because actually Christmas starts very early in our house. December maybe isn't even too early, and you know, the music just drives you mad, doesn't it? And until Christmas. But I think, you know, certainly we use Spotify a lot, and you know, I'm sure other systems have similar issues. I mean, you just end up hearing the same sort of stuff over and over again. And I feel like, you know, with respect to recommendation systems, you know, there's always this kind of echo chamber effect that you just hear more of what you just listened to. And, you know, you see the same with news feeds. And, you know, I feel like you actually want to inject diversity and creativity into these recommendation algorithms, rather than just like more of the same, which seems to be the default design of these things. And also, you know, perhaps a little bit similar problem, you know, personalization shouldn't be just a point in time. You know, tastes evolve, your digital persona evolves. And I think recommendation systems need to have that kind of temporal aspect to them, rather than just being kind of data extrapolation based on, you know, a one-off sample. So I think, you know, yeah, recommendation systems that are interesting would be on my list.
Yeah, I think that idea of the kind of human narrative that, or a journey through, is a very interesting one to develop. So Eleni, the final word then on.
Yeah, and actually mine builds on from everyone else's as well, actually. So I was kind of just thinking, I'd really like to see just like really simple UX, you know, real visibility and clarity for the users, and especially kind of across the different services, just some level of consistency with that as well.
Great. Well, thank you all very much. I think with that, I would like to thank everybody who's been involved today. Obviously, thanking our 4 speakers and the university who've helped us to put this event on, and of course the support from the Festival of Social Science to enable the whole thing to run. Thank you very much. Thank you for joining us, and we hope soon to be able to make a recording of this available publicly. So if you wanted to catch up on any parts of it, you'll be able to do so. Thank you very much, and goodbye.